Welcome to this interview by the Write to You community. This is a community for writers in all stages. And this is actually the first interview that we are doing. And it is very apt that the first person we interview be Valsan Thampu, who is an author, an educator, theologian, and my writing mentor. He's written a lot of books and articles. Among his books, there's an autobiographical work called On a Stormy Course, and there's also a slightly philosophical non-fiction book called Beyond Religion. I've had the privilege of meeting him in person and asking him questions related to the writing journey, and I'm so glad that he suggested doing an interview through which he can share some of his hard-earned wisdom with the larger community of writers. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Some of the people in our community write well, but they are not very sure whether to call themselves writers. Others call themselves writers, but they worry that they shouldn't use the word to denote themselves. So my first question for you is, in your opinion, what makes someone a writer?
Well, ideally, no one should call himself a writer or an author. Being an author is a distinction recognized first by others, of which recognition the person concerned becomes gradually and gratefully aware. So that's how it is. So then, what is it that makes a person an author? Well, obviously, a certain gift, or if I may use the religious word for it, talent. I believe that God in His wisdom distributes talents. He doesn't allow talents, capabilities to be concentrated in a few. And talents are of various kinds, and I believe that all talents are valuable, though given the peculiar nature of the human mind, we create a certain hierarchy of value as regards these talents. Maybe from a divine point of view, offering a kind word to a person in depression is as valuable as writing an epic poem or a novel or whatever, right? So, there must be this sense of valuing whatever happens to be the special gift of a person. So no one should really get into the illusion that only an author is creative or valuable or worth our respect. I believe that everybody who exercises or makes good use of his or her aptitudes or talents or special skills is worthy of respect. Now, that said, coming specifically to the plight or the, shall we say, the distinction of being an author, I would certainly identify creativity as the insignia, the hallmark. Now then we need to understand what creativity is. There are two types of sharing. One is sharing what already exists. For example, as a teacher, my life was, or my work was mostly confined to sharing the goodness of what others have created. In the case of an author, because of his creativity, he can share with people what no one has ever shared with anyone else before him. So it's a very unique kind of sharing, and the audience or readers or whatever, they also feel privileged. So this kind of creativity creates a relationship of very special privilege, which is what I believe humanity all over the world universally values. Now, one aspect of creativity is the eagerness to transcend the given. I believe that a creative person must be also an unhappy person. But an unhappy person who knows to make excellent use of his unhappiness and to make it as it were the raw material for the happiness of others, and through that his own happiness. So an author is, I believe, only entitled to what I call byproduct happiness. He doesn't pursue happiness, he does not seek happiness, he doesn't queue up for happiness in any of the familiar outlets. He transcends the given because he is in a state of sublime disquietude with the status quo, with the given. And it might be of interest to point out that Sigmund Freud refers to this state as neurosis. He believes that the predicament of an author involves some kind of neurosis. And it, in fact, also says that neurosis is the builder of cities. That's only as an aside. So there are two types of people in the world. One is those who are perfectly at home with the given. And they try to relate to the existing situation, systems, structures, institutions, scheme of things to try and derive the maximum advantage therefrom. But there are others, and they are a very tiny group of people, who would like to relate also to that which does not exist. Okay? So that's, I believe, is something not particularly ordinary, it's somewhat extraordinary. So that's part of this burden or the agony of being creative. Secondly, I would also say that a writer or a creative person also is imbued and impelled by a sense of beauty. Now, the sense of beauty that impels or inspires such a person is not the cosmetic kind of beauty. I believe it's a spiritual kind of beauty. And that spiritual beauty pertains to the totality of life. Cosmetic beauty pertains to parts of life or parts of the human body. For example, cosmetic beauty might concentrate its attention mostly on the face. I would like to look better, that kind of thing. Whereas spiritual beauty would concentrate on your being better. You understand? The inner beauty, the inner resource, the inner goodness, or as Jesus says, the inner light, which then radiates, as I've been saying, that radiates as the energy of goodness to the world around. So it is the second kind of the spiritual beauty that I correlate with creativity. At the same time, the creative person bears the cross of creativity in the sense that his sense of beauty is situated mostly in a context of ugliness. The world around is not beautiful, right? Or its beauty is not evident. So, in that sense, a creative person stands rooted like the lotus plant in the sludge of life, but still manages to lift his or her imagination or concentration or mind or being above the level of the sludge and produces something out of that relationship, even with the ugly and the troublesome or the disquieting. So that's a very special kind of a power. So that's why, one of my favorite poems is Ode on a Grecian Urn by John Keats, where the last stanza says that beauty is truth and truth beauty, and that's all ye know and all ye need to know. So the connection between truth and beauty, you understand? And truth is spiritual, so therefore it's not cosmetic beauty. Now, perhaps the final point I'd make in relation to your question is that unlike most people who would like to relate to the immediate and the given, a creative person is one who overcomes the seductiveness of proximity. That is, whatever is ready to hand. Okay? He renounces shortcuts and easy solutions. He refuses to grab whatever is near at hand. He is not interested in obvious patterns. He is not satisfied with the given. I may compare an author to a person who stands on one leg and with the other, and the other leg is poised towards the unknown and the beyond. That's the reason why anyone with this core of creativity also harbors a continent of mystery within oneself. Now, that's, of course, a closely guarded secret. No writer of any substance, any merit, would ever lay it bare. It's a sacred secret that an author carries within himself. Okay? Maybe I'll stop there for the time being.
Thank you for that very detailed and beautiful explanation. So I want to ask a little bit about your writing journey. You mentioned spiritual beauty, creativity, unhappiness, and a sort of imagination and mystery. Are these traits that you saw in yourself when you started off as a writer?
Now, you don't see everything clearly and in full when you begin. In fact, the life of an author is very clearly and beautifully a journey of discovery. You begin only with a sort of vague intuition. And an important part of that intuition is the realization that you have a destiny, a calling, perhaps an area of responsibility, which is perhaps out of the ordinary, which in fact begins also to interfere with a lot of other things in your life. For example, even as a boy, a very young boy, I found it difficult to relate to everyone. I could relate to a few, but I didn't have many friends, for example. So it does sort of set you apart in that sense. Now, looking back, sometimes I wonder whether I had an abnormal childhood. But I can clearly recall the times every now and then, actually, that I would just get into my room, shut my door, and lose myself in thought. Not in any particular stream of thought. A sense of wonder, for example, which includes all kinds of things, including the question, why have I come into this world? Why in this sort of peculiar circumstances? I used to wonder about the wide expanse of the sky and the horizon, the stars twinkling in the night, so on and so forth. And I used to wonder, what's the connection between me and that sort of thing? This huge world, and I'm such a tiny dot, a small little worm. But yet I could feel that there is some connection without understanding what that connection is. And therefore, all of my life was also in part an attempt to understand that connection and to develop a closer and better and more meaningful connectivity to this larger, wider context. So, so you don't really start off with a very well-defined roadmap. What you do is you begin a journey in faith. And I remember, for example, sitting in the classroom of staff room of St. Stephen's College in 1981. I was, of course, quite tired after a series of lectures. It was close to lunch. And suddenly, a sort of intuition began to knock at the door of my mind. That intuition also made me realize that I need to have something to do with the world beyond St. Stephen's College. You see, St. Stephen's is a kind of institution which everything is inbred, and people are almost discouraged from looking beyond the boundaries of St. Stephen's. It's assumed that everything beyond the hedges of St. Stephen's College is inferior. So you sort of turn away from. Now I began to realize that that's wrong. So I began to realize that the whole of the country must be my classroom. So it's part of this kind of early intuition I had as a little boy, that I began to feel connected to the larger cosmos and that kind of thing without any specific content. It's a very vague kind of feeling. So, but as from 1981, therefore, I began to prepare myself in a very, very concentrated, very pointed, disciplined manner. My very quality of my reading changed, the range of my reading changed, the way I would read, the way I would absorb, the way I would record ideas. And I began to develop a very deep delight in finding myself afloat in a universe of ideas. And that began to be a very, very enjoyable experience. So that's perhaps what it is like. But then as you go on and on and on, what happens is, at various stages, various seeds of thought or various insights come into you. How they come, I do not know, frankly. And they fall like a seed into the soil of your soul. And you harbor it, you cherish it, you allow it to stay there embedded in the most sacred region of your life. And you try to nurture it, water it, manure it, cultivate it through your reading, reflection, particularly reflecting on experiences. And gradually this insight grows and grows and grows. Like the parable that Jesus teaches, the parable of the mustard seed, which sprouts and becomes a huge tree which sends its branches to the end of the world. It's exactly like that, actually. So when you reach that stage, at the end point, it becomes imperative for you to write it out. You can't hold back anymore. And there, when you, in that plight, when you sit down to write, it becomes a torrential downpour. I would sit for hours together, 8 hours, 10 hours, I would write. I mean, the international standardization for the daily output of an author is about 1,000 words per day. I used to write 5,000 words, 6,000 words, 7,000 words. And that's the first draft. So anyway, in other words, it's a very, very interesting, very exhilarating, very demanding, sometimes agonizing journey in life. But at each stage, you realize that you're evolving, and that's the greatest reward. I believe that no manuscript is worth publishing if, through the writing of it, you do not emerge changed from it. So I am at the moment in my 21st avatar. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, and also for talking a little bit about your writing process. You mentioned the first draft So,
Yeah.
are there subsequent drafts? What does that process
Absolutely.
look
Yes.
like for you?
Yes. You see, what I do in the first draft is I simply download my mind. I empty my mind onto my computer. Somehow, mysteriously, I developed a fascination for typing. When I was a young person, I was in what's called the pre-degree class in those days, and people used to laugh at me because in those days only a person who wanted to limit his professional life to being a typist would ever learn typing. No one could sort of figure out why a person like me would want to learn typing. But I was so fascinated by this that I joined a typewriting institute during one summer vacation, and I mastered typing in exactly 1 month because of my keen interest in it. But then, immediately thereafter, something that I could not even have hoped for in my wildest dreams happened. I was gifted with a very beautiful typewriter by my mother's cousin, who was at that time working in Kuwait. I still remember it's a beautiful Italian Olivetti Studio 45, green color, a cute typewriter. So I began to do all my work on my computer. Therefore, typing is easier for me than talking. I'm as facile on the keyboard as that. So I never write. I just key everything in. So once that process takes about 4 weeks, 5 weeks, maximum 6 weeks to produce about 100,000 words. Then, of course, the real work begins, which will be spread over the next 5-6 months. That will be a series of editing, 5-6 series of editing, and each editing will concentrate on one aspect. Maybe the diction, grammar, syntax, the thought the architecture of the thought, the layout, the progression, felicity of expression, cross references, gaps in argument, and so on and so forth. So everything is sort of ironed out, and then after about 6 months, the manuscript would be in a state at which it could then be sent on to a possible publisher.
Thank you for explaining that. I think sometimes we have this idea that the first draft has to be perfect, but it seems like it's the editing process that makes an idea into a work of art, and it's something that we need to persist with.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
In fact, it's very interesting. This used to amaze me no end. Because I used to tell myself, you see, there is really no difference between the person who produces the first draft and the person who produces the 6th draft. The same person, right? Then how come that when I was working on the first draft, when I was producing the first draft, it did not have a perfect birth? Because all those things existed within me. How come that the perfection that did, or the knowledge, or the sense of style, or whatever, that did exist within me, did not find expression through the first draft? So then I realized that this kind of struggle is very essential for one's evolution as an author. Because, as most people may not realize it, our growth does not happen in the creative, on the creative plane. Our growth does not happen merely in terms of our sensitivity or responsiveness to some outward stimuli. The outward stimuli are required. But what is even more important is our growth happens through our ability, which is increased and perfected gradually through the struggle, our ability to connect to the best that is already present within us. And it's, later on, when I studied depth psychology, I of course realized that all of human achievement, the entire human race, exists within every individual. As Carl Jung said, the individual is in the race, and the race is race in the sense human race, humankind, not in the other sense of the term. The individual is in the race, which is obvious, and also the race is in the individual. So we are actually the beneficiaries of the great work that has gone on. In a mysterious way, we are connected to Homer and Virgil and Dante and Shakespeare and Kalidasa and Milton and so on and so forth, right? So we don't even discover 10% of our real potential within us. Even the most developed person, that much lies dormant within us. So it is through this kind of agony and struggle that we are able to establish a kind of, shall we say, additional neural connection to the inner landscape. You understand? So in that sense, it's both. Our growth happens both outwards and inwards.
There is a question that I have been asked before, which is with respect to this pursuit of perfection or of growth. So the question that sometimes people ask is, how is this different from perfectionism? Do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, now perfectionism, see, I am sort of by nature a bit suspicious of all isms. And the quest of perfection, as I told you, is a very silent, mysterious, inner, hidden, unmanifest, at the same time profound experience of the person, of which he himself is not fully aware. He becomes aware of it, sufficiently aware of it only in retrospect. Perfectionism becomes something of a posture. You begin to sort of create a list of the various items or attributes that together constitute perfection. So you create a formulaic approach to perfection. Whereas perfection cannot be a formula. Nothing organic can be formulaic.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think I really liked your explanation of it being something quiet, something that happens slowly and persistently, as opposed to something that we're trying to force.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think as new writers, we have this tendency to try to have a perfect first draft, and we set ourselves up for failure, I think, when we do that. I remember we had a conversation in Trivandrum at your home when I asked you, how do you make time for writing? I don't know what you thought of my question then, but I found your answer very bewildering. You said, the question is, how do I make time for anything else? I found this very fascinating because I feel like there's so many things to distract a writer today. And of course, you had responsibilities even when you started your career as a writer. You were working, you had children, you were taking care of them as well. So, in the context of both the distractions as well as the responsibility, how do you make time for writing?
Now, I would also question the very notion of distraction. This distraction is something of like a shadow. It begins to bother you when you don't have a sort of focus that a healthy person needs to have. For example, if you're really interested in anything, even cooking, you're not distracted, frankly. So distraction happens by default as a consequence of insufficient engagement with, due to lack of enthusiasm, insufficient engagement with whatever is at hand. Now, one of the basic characteristics of an author is the capacity for absolute concentration. Because concentration is, again, the byproduct of a passionate interest. For a person who takes his vocation to be an author seriously, the need to nourish his inner being, the inner life, is far more imperious than the need to provide nutrition to his body. You understand? And I'm not exaggerating at all. Especially when I write, I used to lose about 3 to 5 kilograms in body weight because I would forget to eat. In fact, I wouldn't even allow anyone to enter my room. I would go out of my room and eat something only if I felt like having, and sometimes I would skip meals. So for me, writing has been such a passionate absorption. I would forget the whole world. And here I must also say, in case somebody is interested in knowing this, see, I've from very early in my life, I've handled serious health problems. I've lived my life in pain. I've been through states in my life in which if somebody had asked for my name, I would have said my name is pain. I've had that kind of excruciating pain. But I found, to my great excitement and relief, that writing for me has been therapeutic. I would forget all my pains, even my exhaustion, when I get into the bliss, the ecstasy of writing. And I'm glad to say that thanks to this God-given gift of writing, I was able to manage without painkillers for the last 30, 40 years in my life. So I'm giving this as an example to tell you that distraction is not at all a problem. For anyone who is passionately engaged with anything that connects to the native genius of that person, it cannot be said about somebody who just wants to do something for because it's a fashionable thing to do. So you have a sense that you are actually in perfect harmony with your destiny, harmony with the core that you really are, the quintessential person that you are, and the very purpose of your existence in this world. So when you are in engagement with that, you are in a state of passion. That passion serves as the greatest fortress or protection against every imaginable distraction.
Thank you. There is a question from Emmanuel, which I will read out for you.
Sure.
He asks, when you have a strong idea or several thoughts you want to communicate, what happens between having the initial thought and actually beginning to write? How do you determine where to start?
This question is more or less anticipated in what I said at the beginning. I said that an idea comes like a small seed of thought, right? Then you don't immediately articulate it. Actually, the key to this insight is the word express itself. Express is a metaphor. That word is a metaphor. In terms of the origin of that word, express actually relates to pressing out milk from the breast. That's the metaphoric background of that word. So what happens is, an idea or an insight or a seed of thought comes into you, and you would certainly have the temptation to immediately express it, to articulate it, because you're excited about it. But if you articulate it, you are expressing it, you're pressing it out, then that seed will never grow. For example, to make this clearer, it's very interesting that when I am working on a manuscript. It's like one of my vital organs. It's organically, intimately connected to my very being. But the moment I have finalized the manuscript and sent it on to a publisher, I feel that the organic connection is severed. Because I've expressed myself. Period. So that particular theme will not grow any further. Because I have myself voluntarily put a full stop to it. So I would always advocate that if anyone gets an insight about which one is excited, resist the temptation to express it immediately. Allow that to take root and to grow and to burgeon within oneself. It will become a full-fledged tree. And then you will realize within yourself that magical moment, or I may use a scientific term, that titration moment. You see, titration, you sort of put one liquid into another using that, was it burette or pipette, whatever. I forget all this. Then a magical moment comes when one drop changes the color of everything. You remember that experiment, which is done in schools? Okay, it's like that. Okay, so that magical moment must be waited for. It's also very much part of what happens in nature. Look at a farmer. A farmer sows the seed, then he waits for the harvest. He doesn't sow the seed and go there next day to collect the harvest. He gives it time. There is a season for everything. So I would always advocate holding the idea back so that you maintain a continuous relationship with that idea, like a fetus within the mother's womb. Nurture that idea and allow that idea to attain maturity. Then the time for the birth of a new life will automatically announce itself.
Another important part of the writing process is the reading or research that goes into the writing. Are there some kinds of material that you focus on when you're working on a book or a manuscript, and how do you choose what to work on?
Yes and no. I would have a very, very minimal reading list. But in my experience, very often that reading list gets or becomes obsolete. A certain line of thought which initially did not exist would come into the equation. There'll be a change, then you chase that idea. By the way, unlike Western authors, I don't begin writing with a very clearly laid out blueprint for the book. I remember I was in Oxford in 1994. I was given a scholarship, a fellowship to go there to write a book on HIV/AIDS for the European audience. I'd already published a book from the Indian context, and that book was well received in the West. So an organization from the UK contacted me and asked if I would be interested in writing a book for the European audience, and I accepted that. So I was given a 4-month fellowship to be in Oxford. And I was also given a contact person who was a professor of ethics in Oxford. Now, he was appalled that I was beginning to write a book without the total ground plan of the book clearly spelled out. You understand? For me, creating a ground plan which is sort of closed on all ends is very suffocating. Because the most beautiful part of my experience in writing books in particular, in contrast to writing articles, is that in the process of writing, newer and newer insights would come. Now, if I start off with a completely developed blueprint, I would be imprisoned within its still, say, outlines, and I would not keep the windows open to receive this fresh drafts of ideas. So, therefore, my reading would often go in a kind of zigzag manner. And in fact, I would read one book, and from that book, I may come across a reference to another book which would interest me. Then I would read that book. So, the second thing I do is I make sure that I read an assortment of books belonging to various branches of knowledge, because for an author, the most important thing is the widening of his mental horizon and the enrichment of his mind with insights and ideas from all sorts of branches of knowledge, maximum possible. He must truly have or cultivate an encyclopedic mind, not in a quantitative sense, but in a qualitative sense.
Yeah, thank you. One last question for me. So, some of us have had rocky starts as writers.
Yeah.
I wondered what your early journey was like. Were there any struggles that you experienced as a young or new writer?
Perhaps I was more fortunate than most people. Time was always on my side. I'm looking back, I'm quite amazed. For example, my first newspaper article, was on the emergency, 1975-76, that period. Now I had the advantage of time, because you write something on emergency and it will find a favorable response. It was published. So that gave me a lot of encouragement. And then came another break. A newspaper approached me to write a column. So I did. And that was an acknowledgement. And my articles used to come with my photographs. And then I tried with various other newspapers, and each one of them accepted my articles. Not a single article I ever wrote remained unpublished in those days. Now the situation has changed exactly in the opposite direction. No newspaper will publish any article that I write. That's a great change that Modi's India has brought about. So then came, for example, as far as writing books is concerned, HIV/AIDS. I was the first to produce a book on HIV/AIDS in the whole of Asia from a theological angle. And that was a byproduct of my engagement with Christian Medical College, Vellore, which was the first to form a task force to work in the field of AIDS. And I was invited to be the theological consultant by the chief of that team, who was Jacob T. John, at that time the professor and head of the Department of Virology of Christian Medical College. So, my book was published without, I didn't even have to wait. It was just published, and copies were sold like hotcakes. So like that, one after the other, opportunities came, and I did not have to run after publishers. I mean, that may not be the case with most others. But perhaps what worked in my favor is I was always engaging myself with the serious issues of the times, because I believed that every crisis is also an opportunity. Opportunity for what? It is during a period of crisis that people whose minds would otherwise be shut against new insights, new truths, or unpleasant truths would open up and receive. So your receptivity is much better if you really work in terms of the crises that emerge from time to time. For example, I wrote a book on drug addiction. I've written hundreds of articles on communalism. I published a book on Gujarat riots, for that matter. So when you write on topical matters, then there is a ready acceptance. And probably that was, and actually, it's not that I sort of planned it in that manner. It just happened to be like that. Because I felt, this is something I need to say. This, in a way, it's an offshoot of my idea of being a teacher. I believe sincerely that a teacher must not confine himself to his classroom, and that a teacher is in a state of great responsibility and indebtedness towards the society as a whole. So a teacher must also acknowledge and take upon himself the duty to generate wisdom and guidance to the members of the society to cope with the emerging situations. For example, HIV/AIDS is a problem that particularly affects the youth, right? As a teacher, I was working with the youth. So why wouldn't working in the field of HIV/AIDS find a place in my basket of concerns as a teacher, even as a teacher? You understand? So much depends on how you perceive the range and scope of your relevance and your responsibility with respect to the main profession that you're doing. For example, as a doctor, you don't have to confine yourself to your hospital, the wards, or the patients, even after doing justice to them. You can actually look at the big picture. And our growth happens when we connect the chosen small sliver of field of service to the big picture. Otherwise, our growth remains circumscribed, limited to meeting the requirements of the very limited context. Our growth is determined by the context that we choose for ourselves. That's why those who live only for themselves will never grow. Selfishness shuts the door against your personal development.
Thank you. So I think it's time to open out the session so that others can also ask questions.
Sure.
I see that there is a comment. Okay, this is Vijay Auntie. She's saying, in this context, I want to thank you for your recent video on FCRA.
Right. Thank you, yes.
Are there any questions? Yeah, sorry.
I appreciate that feedback. Yeah.
Are there any questions? Yes, Angela.
Yes. So we were talking about, I hope my voice is clear. We were talking about how we walk